How are you?
Okay, so dear colleagues, good evening. Happy to meet you today at our second session of TESOL Ukraine series from professional writers. And today we have as our guest Jessica Zychowicz with her presentation or with her session Writing Beyond Borders, Integrating Culture and Identity in Storytelling. And let me briefly introduce Jessica, and you will ask her more if you have questions. So Jessica was a Peace Corps volunteer in Ukraine, born in the United States. She always had interest in our part of the world because of her Polish roots. And she also worked as a Fulbright scholar in Kyiv Mahila Academy. And at present, Jessica is the head of the Fulbright office in Kyiv. And also, we don't have our member Elena Halapchuk-Tarnavska here, but as soon as I told her that you would be our guest, she got so excited because she said that you are a real star in gender issues and in many, many other issues. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marina. It's really an honor to be here. I feel that I am home among friends because as a fellow writer and also speaker of different languages and former English teacher, I feel, great kinship with all of you. So yes, today's focus will be writing beyond borders, integrating culture and identity in storytelling. And we will think of some different methods. I will share with you my experience and some methods I used that shaped me as a scholar and also as a creative writer and as a translator and somebody who works with visual culture as well. So hopefully I will bring up some inspiring thoughts and ideas, and then we will have question and answer where we can have a dialogue. And I'm really excited to hear a little bit about your practice in writing and teaching or whatever you are using language for. So yes, as Marina mentioned, my journey, my connection to Ukraine is very deep and very nuanced in many ways because I have grandparents who spoke Polish mostly and came from the United States. My grandparents were born in the United States, but my great-grandparents came from Rzeszów area, and my husband and his family, they are all from Ukraine, from the western regions of Lviv, etc. But I didn't meet him until 2019. And by that point, I already knew Ukrainian and wrote a book about Ukraine. So it's not because of my husband that I wrote my book. I always think it's important to say that because as a gender scholar, I really, stand on my own as a writer. And how did I arrive at the topic of my first book, which was published in 2020, and very soon will be published in a Ukrainian edition in about 3 months here with Arthus Press and Maidan Revolution of Dignity Museum. So I started working on that book as a dissertation that was in 2008, at the University of Michigan in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literature. And at the time, because of the university I was in, they allowed me to form a very interdisciplinary support committee in forming a framework for my writing. So I had a film scholar, I had a historian, and I had a sociologist. A sociologist was very important for me to have because in creating a methodology to write about Ukraine, especially contemporary Ukraine, because my book covers the period of 2005 from the Orange Revolution until 2020 when it was published. And to write about this period of time is a great challenge because of two revolutions. And it's always difficult anyway to write about your own contemporaries. People who are alive will critique you. You are trying to capture in words their experiences as well as your own, because you can never really be completely objective when you are writing about humans. And hopefully you do not strive to be completely objective. Maybe if you're a political scientist, you are working with large data sets and you're kind of creating some objective structures, but still interpretation is involved. So why am I going into all of this detail? Because I want to begin with, again, the title of our session, Writing Beyond Borders. This idea of writing about place is very interesting and really right now so important for all Ukrainians and all of us connected so deeply to Ukraine. How do we write about place? Place is intimately tied up with our family history. As I mentioned, my family story involves immigration. It also involves multiple citizenships in one house. And place is also connected to the environment, the physical world of the food we eat, the buildings we live in, the schools we send our children to. These narratives of place throughout time can provide markers, chronotopes, as the literary term goes, that are symbolic or that are a system of signs, for example, theoretical signs, or even an etymology of names that all of us in a community around Ukraine would recognize, such as Kobylyanska, with certain ideas of emancipation and Western Ukraine. How can we create strong stories that use these chronotopes, these signs marked in recognized shared places without becoming cliche and without limiting ourselves, let's say, into one person's idea of who Kobylyanska was or one person's prior experience? How can we create a shared or a diverse and multifaceted construction in our stories about Ukraine and with Ukrainians that opens up to some universals, to some recognition from people who know nothing about Ukraine or who have never been to Ukraine? How can they recognize this as a place that evokes some kind of interest or triggers some memories for them? This is what will make your stories culturally iconic worldwide and inviting, and possibly also can become powerful entry points for those who maybe don't have the kind of expertise they need to enter in and understand contemporary Ukraine. As a scholar, when I started working on my book, I had very few mentors who could support me in my university because the only expert on Ukraine, the historian Luke had already left University of Michigan for a promotion to go to Brown University. And there were limited amounts of knowledge I could get about the place of modern Ukraine through experts and historians on Poland, Belarus, and Russia, who know obviously something about the territories of Ukraine throughout time, having been colonized by these different powers, but not really the same understanding of the people inhabiting the territory between the Vistula River all the way to Kharkiv. And this was my sort of area I wanted to understand more about. So I needed to reach out and find mentors in other regions, other universities, which led me after graduation to Canada, where you have lots of support historically and still today for institutions that provide scholarships for writers like me who wanted to focus on Ukraine because of so many Ukrainian immigrants and diaspora there who have raised the funds to support those scholarships. So I was very glad and honored to be supported for 4 years in Canada. And I found also a Canadian publisher, University of Toronto Press, which is one of the best publishers in the world for any scholar writing about Ukraine. Today, when I to a lot of even historians of Eastern Europe, I can tell immediately that they haven't spent time in the place of Ukraine. I think the strongest way you can write beyond borders, that you can write about culture in an area or among a people, is actually spending time there. And this is again where social science became very informative and interesting for me. When I was traveling to Ukraine for over 15 years, every year, and some of those years actually living for 2 years at a time in Ukraine, I was talking to anthropologists, Ukrainian anthropologists, and also colleagues of mine from different universities in Europe and the US who were using methods that anthropologists use to capture culture, to transcribe, to document. And I started to use some of these methods. And one of them, if you haven't used it before, that's great for students as well in your teaching, is this idea of thick description. Thick description is where one observer, the anthropologist, writes simply what they are hearing in a dialogue around them, or seeing, or feeling. And what is important about thick description, it involves not only the description of what's out there in our surroundings, but also self-reflexivity, how we ourselves are viewing a certain frame within that place. So there are certain details that I would see and understand in Ukraine that other researchers would not understand, simply because I had spent a lot of time living inside homes of Ukrainian families, sitting around the table, eating, Easter meal together. I had a different vocabulary, a different entry point into the cultural rituals around me. And in connecting with anthropologists in Ukraine, I also needed to become open to criticism of my limits as a writer, things they could see about Ukraine and understand that I couldn't see, and to interview other interlocutors is also a social science method that is it's very, very invaluable for a writer about culture today, even if you are not writing about events like I was writing about changes and events, cultural events in society. If you're not writing about events and you're writing only about an archive, well, it's useful to interview any others you think are engaging with that same archive or that same author. If you are a scholar of the paintings of Alexandra Exter, it would be useful to talk to some folks right now in New York City who maybe are going to her exhibit there, to the exhibit of her paintings in New York, see the reception, see how culture is alive, and see how a place is actually transported, and how texts and images can be a kind of portal to a place where somebody's never been. So somebody who is living in New York and knows nothing about Alexandra Exter and maybe will go to the exhibit in the Ukrainian Museum will learn something and will be changed through this portal of culture that expresses elements of an identity that is recognizable as a Ukrainian identity among a vast community of people in Ukraine. But outside of Ukraine, people are still learning, what is this Ukrainianness? What makes Ukraine Ukraine? It's not only territory, it's not only location, it's people. And what are some qualities of the people what are some of the values, the shared values of the people of Ukraine that are carried and transmitted through different cultural texts? So I think that this, difference between written text and visual text is changing, and I'm interested to hear your experiences in the classroom with your students about how they maybe are using visual culture to learn and write with English and Ukrainian text, written text, because I think for their generation, the social media generation, more and more people are reading and becoming more literate in terms of visual culture, reading images, learning how to read and understand photographs, for example, and films and paintings in a way that is not about consumption only, but communication and self-stylization, self-expression. I would definitely like to share with you an assignment that I did at Kyiv when I was there as a Fulbright scholar with some of my students. I was in the Department of Sociology. And why was I in the Department of Sociology? Because they have really wonderful gender scholars there. Some of you maybe know Tamara Martsenyuk, a colleague of mine, and others. But what I did was I taught a course on visual sociology, and throughout the semester, we studied different examples of visual texts and interviews with Susan Sontag, for example, on YouTube, which are really great. There's some wonderful interviews with her from the 1970s. We looked at a lot of different cases also of urban culture and graffiti and different social manifestations of visual texts that we could isolate and define as a community creating its own sign systems. So graffiti is a good example, because in urban spaces, graffiti kind of takes on its own language and has its own sign systems between different graffiti artists. And it's hard to understand those sign systems if you are not in that community. So there are certain elements of written and visual texts that have passwords almost that you need to know in order to decode the signs and understand the community. And we might call these like esoteric texts. And for the students, they became very interested in this idea of defining the borders of a text. So if you are writing beyond borders and you are writing about place, you do have to limit or create a frame for your community, for your location that you are describing. And that is more complicated than it seems. And the students, for their assignment, their final assignment, needed to identify and articulate a community somewhere in the city of Kyiv. And they needed to do a thick description about that community. So, for example, one student decided to write about the people on Andreevsky Spust who sell their antiques and their old kind of photographs and different items that belong to others at one time that were not newly produced souvenirs, but usually found objects or donated objects or loaned or bought, collected. And it was this fabulous text about her interviewing these individual sellers and collectors on Andreevsky Spust, and then writing about some of the problems they faced in their community with finding permits to sell in the city, some of their notions, their ideas about what has value in these objects, why they would collect one object over the other, and why they felt it was important to somehow save some of these items as relics of the Soviet past. What to keep, what to give away, became a very fascinating discussion about historical change in Ukraine since 1991. And it was precisely also the student's own identity, her young age, actually, that produced some of the storytelling by the collectors, because they were older than her. They wanted to tell her their stories about the past. And I don't know if they would express the same enthusiasm if they were interviewed by one of their peers who would get a different reaction. So in choosing your ethnographic text, definitely the number one self-reflexive pressure on the text will be your identity. And some of the students even went so far as to write about some of their frustrations in being young women, for example, and being limited in what knowledge they could access from elderly men who would not speak to them in the same way or give them a kind of authority as researchers as they thought they would receive from society. So the students wrote in a very astute way about gender in the role of the writer and the researcher as a epistemological frame for a study that they could map in their project the kinds of limits faced in their work as women, but also some of the access points to knowledge that they had, some of the benefits of their perceived identity, whether or not they perceive themselves as women or in one way or the other. Often, almost in every case, they perceive themselves differently than those who interviewed them, but it produces surprises and interesting dialogue to document those differences in your stories. And I think if you are working with creative texts, then the characters that you create, the interiorities, the interior life of your characters always will differ from the dialogues that you're creating and producing. And that's also something that I think can be an important element of creating a story about Ukraine that is not only set in Ukraine. And with some of the best writers in the diaspora that I communicated with in Canada, especially Myrna Kostas, who has written, I think now 7 books over her lifetime. She writes a lot about the interior struggle of being Ukrainian and Canadian, and not always, almost never able to reconcile these two identities, not because of her own lived experience, but because of the historical conflicts in Canada that are still working themselves out through the community. She is an epic writer, so she writes on a scale involving a long period of time, 200 years of emigration from Ukraine to Canada, but also the return to Ukraine in her stories is very interesting because she has spent much of her career and her life traveling to Eastern Europe and throughout Eastern Europe and Ukraine, even during the Soviet Union. So we can talk more about those kinds of writings that are different from scholarly writings. And I would love to hear from you about any assignments or any methods that have worked well with your students who maybe are learning language or maybe are learning writing, but I definitely want to hear your thoughts. So we can maybe open the floor.
So please, if you have any questions or if you have just any ideas on ethnic writing.
So I'm just not sure if I understand exactly what we're being asked. So you mean like our experience in what way?
To share an assignment that has worked or that you really liked with your students in their writing about community or about place. Or they're writing about Ukraine, if your students are writing about Ukraine. Any surprising, or what are some, yeah, Tatiana, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. But before trying to answer your question, may I ask a couple of mine, if you please?
Sure.
Yeah. So talking about creative writing or any kind of writing, and when you get down to do it, the first thing comes first, what to write about. And I'm wondering, where do you take your ideas? Where do you take your themes? And the second step is the first line on your paper. What to write about, first of all. And do you feel what is, how may I put it, writer's block, and how to overcome it? Have you developed your own approaches or methods to do that? Mm-hmm. How do you cope with that?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. All right. For writer's block, a lot of different ideas there. In my writing, in my life, I have used automatic writing as a way to overcome writer's block. So automatic writing is where you sit down with a piece of paper and no distractions, and you just write whatever comes to your mind. And you do that for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then you switch to your project, and it should help you to flow with your ideas. And that is also a technique that was used by surrealist artists who believed that automatic writing was the only kind of writing that should be done and the most authentic. And that's maybe the extreme side of the experience, but you actually can generate some interesting and good material sometimes when you just let yourself write anything. I see the sky, and this is used also in therapy and in recovery of a kind of sense of balance psychologically. There are also more practical ways to overcome writer's block for academics that have worked for me. And Those are staying organized with a system of warm-up tasks. So if you have a big project like a book and you know that there are a lot of tiny edits you're going to have to do, like, editing your footnotes in chapter 5, set that up as a self-assignment for the next morning. So when you wake up in the morning, that's all you do. You just edit your footnotes in chapter 5, and you might finish in 1 hour or 2 hours. It might take you a long time, but you should do the task until you complete it. And then let yourself do the more theoretical, difficult writing, because your brain has to warm up. And a lot of novice writers or beginning writers, they think that writing is a sprint and not a marathon, and that you can always perform at your top level when you need to, that you can just jump right into the page and perform and write the most difficult section. You should let yourself breathe and skip around a little bit in your text. Try to let yourself write the easy texts, easy parts, or do some minor edits on the days when you're tired, and systematically you will get better and better as a writer. It's that systematic work, that constant editing of your own work, that 90% of writing is really editing what you already wrote. So you have to let yourself get the words on the page and then edit and shape. And sometimes moving one section to another section changes the whole paper and improves it. So you have to give yourself time.
Yeah, thank you very much. But then it's very difficult to write beyond borders, because you cannot stop editing. There is no limit to it. You can just leave it and let it stay like it is. That's all.
Yeah, absolutely
It's
right.
like that.
Absolutely right about it. Yes, for
Yeah.
sure.
And if you allow me, I would like to take a couple of minutes and share my experience. Last spring, I visited Michigan University. I was on an exchange program organized by the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv for the teachers of Ukraine, teachers of English of Ukraine. And one of the items in our agenda was visiting, well, I can't remember, what you might call it. There was a neighboring city, Lansing, I guess. And we visited the center of Ukrainian community there. And I was very much interested what Ukrainian culture smells there and what it looks like. So when we entered the center, we saw a lot of items connected to Ukraine historically, and just visually, spiritually, you name it. And I thought that I know all about those vyshivankas and rushniks and Ukrainian towels and Ukrainian embroidered shirts. But when they started telling the stories of those items, I understood how miserable my knowledge was. But my another observation was that it did not smell Ukraine like it smells here when I'm back home. It's quite different. And then I asked myself a question: does place affect our identity? And of course it does. Yes, the answer is clear. But which way and to what extent? Yeah. What happens to people who are, let's say, displaced or migrated for other reasons, let's say family reunion, economic reasons or political reasons? How does the new place affect their identity? On the one hand, they become ambassadors of their native culture, which they bring with them, yes, and feeling nostalgic, particularly first days, months, and years, they are trying to preserve it, and they do not let this feeling go. They don't want to let this feeling go, this feeling of sickness, homesickness. They even, on the one hand, they are suffering, but on the other hand, they are enjoying it because it is something that gives them the smell or the feeling of home. But on the other hand, they cannot be independent on the society and culture they are in. And you know what? A place is always conceptualized as a container. So when you are there in the place, and your mental picture, your mental worldview, your mental map puts you inside this container. And it's a big question if you can leave it. How can you soar beyond these borders of this container, conceptual container, I mean. So it's interesting to research these issues, the problems of displacement and shifts and modifications of national identity, family bonds, etc. Because being immersed into a new place means being immersed into new style of life, new culture, and then it changes. It greatly modifies your worldview and everything around you. So it's interesting to try to find answers to these questions, I believe.
Definitely. And, in a lot of ancient texts, there's a huge difference in different kinds of movements of people and writing and place. And exile is always or very often conceptualized as punishment. Even, in the Bible, there's a lot written about the exile from Israel as a punishment worse than death. And immigration, though, in different points, at least in the modern world, has often been written about as a story of liberation or a new bright horizon, but it's not so simple either. And certainly there's such a huge and great literature of emigre writing from Ukraine throughout the 20th century. And then now in displacement, a lot of different experiences all combining in reflecting on that, on what has come before. The genres of displaced writing are very broad and have connotations both from the extreme negative end of punishment to the positive end of, seeking a new manifest reality. And it's, very, very broad spectrum, but probably right now in this historical paradigm, the new genres being created in and about and with Ukrainians all over the world are going to redefine what came before. I don't know. Thank you, Tatiana. A lot to think about.
Thank you.
Maybe there are others here who would like to a favorite writer that you're reading.
If you let me, well,
go ahead, Galina.
I'm not going to talk about my favorite writer. Well, Elizaveta is my former student, and she knows for sure that I can talk endlessly about William Somerset Maugham, well, and his works. And actually, I always tell my students that I can talk endlessly about three things. The first is my favorite writer. The second is cats. And the third is gender. So my question is connected with gender. I teach gender, but I'm into linguistic gender. So because I teach gender studies to linguists. Wow. So what kind of gender do you work with? So just I see it's sociology, well, or something else.
Sorry, there's construction, so you might hear some background noise. In my first book, I worked with ideas of women who define themselves as women, and also was thinking with the work of theorists more in the tradition of like Nancy Fraser, who is a good example, in the tradition of thinking about legislation as well. The self-definition of oneself as a woman comes into conflict very often with state legislation on what women can and cannot do with their bodies or with their legal choices in marriage and divorce. And that's for me, that is the area of gender that I'm looking at and interested in, especially in questions that my interlocutors in Ukraine brought to my attention around class and practices around, fair hiring and representation in parliament and companies. I still think these questions are very, very essential in the present moment, in the rebuilding of Ukraine in a way that will preserve opportunities for women. So I learned a lot from my colleagues and some of their writings too, that the sociologists use, like Tamara Martiniuk, that provide data on this. So I have something to actually work from in looking at the data that is used and who's producing it, and it's all related.
Oh, I see. Actually, I used to give my students such a task after reading a poem, a very stereotypical poem about men, and it is entitled Men Are. Well, and I asked my students to write the answer to this poem, Women Are. I've got a collection of many years. I'm planning and have been planning to write an article about that. What kind of images of women there are in the poem. And I can say that they are pretty stereotypical. Well, with women being tender, but sometimes at the same time being strong. So women need flowers, women need nice dresses, heels, but at the same time, if they want, they can drive a car, whatever. There are some there are some ideas. I can buy myself flowers. Well, but in most cases, no, women are not shown as dependent, surely not, but women are showed clearly as are human beings who should be loved well, and listened to. Well, that's probably the most idea. Well, so in those poems, they're great. Are just I always wonder how talented students are. Just I could never write anything like that, really, myself.
And when were they written?
When were they written? Oh, for a long time. So starting from 2013 till the previous 2023. So for almost 10 years. So I collect just, I asked my master students to write them, and so I collect them. So those poems.
That's amazing. I wanted to mention a project, a book that we published last year in Ukraine in English. It was a project between Fulbright Ukraine, which is my office, and America House Kyiv. And what this great resource is a collection of about 15 short stories by Ukrainian young authors who were together in a writing workshop for a whole year before publishing it. So they were reading and editing each other's texts. And all of the stories are set inside Ukraine, and they are actually kind of creative nonfiction. So they are often their own experiences during even the war, 2022, during the year of 2022. And it's really, I think, a good and kind of teachable text, and it's free. So if any of you are interested, I think you can download it from America House website, or if you write to them or to my office, Fulbright Ukraine, we can give you a copy. It's called A Home We've Built. And I really like this concept because it is, again, back to our idea of writing beyond borders. that home is actually in your language, that you carry it with you. And even if you are speaking in English or Ukrainian, and this was something we talked about when we presented this book at America House, we had an event there, and we kept saying it's written in English, but there are some ideas and concepts that don't really translate that make this book very, very Ukrainian. And I hope that you will read it. It's really a precious treasure of ours. But again, it's a home we built. We built this home together throughout the writing workshops.
It would be nice. Yeah, it would be nice to read it.
Yeah, and a lot of the writers are women there. It's a combination of genders, but many women writers.
Men also should have rights sometimes. Yes.
Yeah, once in a while.
Once in a while, yes. Well.
Sapanova, Yulia, did you have your hand up?
I think I don't, but I just have right now I have a question. I heard about the favorite author, and I want to connect it with the topic about gender. Several years ago, like 10 years ago, I would say that my favorite author is J.K. Rowling, but nowadays it's kind of difficult to say it right now, because as a person, she's not so good to me right now, especially of her issues with the people that have their gender identity of being a woman, but not biologically being a woman, and she has has a very cruel point of view about them. And what do you think about it is available nowadays to such people who have like huge impact on the young people, to influence these negative thoughts in their social? And I want to know your thoughts about it.
Thank you. Yeah, I really love J.K. Rowling's books as well, and I also grew up reading Lord of the Rings. I'm a huge fan of Tolkien as well. This genre of fantasy fiction is still really strong, and what the new generation does and adds to it that my generation didn't have, and I know it exists in Kyiv, is this cosplay, like these events where they dress up in costumes together and reenact, almost like in a theater play. They reenact and pretend they are in the world of the book, that they bring the place into their lives through theater acting, but they're not in the theater, they're actually in some room together. And I really like this because I think it is the medicine for this generation that has so much screen time and so much social media. And reading is definitely an isolating act, and so is writing. It's not very social. Writing is, very much a lonely act. So I think to have a community of other readers, writers, is really, it's really important for our health and for the younger generations. They maybe need this even more than we did, in the sense that when they're not reading, they're not maybe talking to other people, they're checking their Facebook, checking their emails. We spend a lot of our lives now reading emails, and I wish I didn't have to. I remember the 90s, I didn't have to read so many emails. I was much younger, but still, yeah, I think that these kind of book clubs, social events can be a great antidote, a great medicine. And J.K. Rowling was, I think, the first to make the real cult of reading a pop phenomenon, to make a real, like, hugely popular, you know, phenomenon, really, of her work. It's brilliant what she did. And I too like The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. I've read all of her books too. I like The Hunger Games. It's more dystopia, but I think it's important for a little bit older age group to think about some of the issues that she presents there. And she uses quite a lot of Greek philosophy, interestingly. There's a good book about her text and all the names that come from Greek philosophy in it. And it's useful if you want to teach about how to write a kind of dystopia or utopia, and to get your students to think about it, to think about philosophy. Her work's really great for that.
I agree. And additional question about that. So sometimes we should divide it, like when we go into the world written by a famous writer, and divide the world he wrote about and his personal points of view on civil, in like personal life, in social action of that. Like we should divide it. The personality of writer and what the writer really writes about.
Maybe. I don't know. What do you think? Or what do others think?
I think several years ago, maybe when I was too young to reflect about it, I would agree that the most important is just a work of this writer. But nowadays, looking at some important questions of our society, I think we should really notice the like red flags of some personality of our even several years ago favorite writer, because we need to build our own thoughts, our own opinion, not just for appreciation of the author we loved before, because some of her points of view in modern world, it's not appropriate for me, unfortunately. Yeah.
Oh, Jessica, your mic is off.
Oh, thank you. Elizaveta?
Yeah, I wanted to add on to Julia's point, because I do actually agree with her wholeheartedly. That well, I suppose like my view of it is, I'm not sure like exactly how to put it into words, but well, I guess to summarize is always apply critical thinking, because I have heard like a lot of these sort of opinions that oh, you know, you should separate the work from the author, like, you know, it doesn't matter what the author does or says, like what matters is what you take from the work. And I feel like sometimes in rare cases that may be true, but in a lot of situations, the author's views end up kind of bleeding into their work, not always intentionally. And you know, it's not like you can just sort of look at people and say, okay, I think this is a good person. They sort of have only good views. It means that their work is always going to be like good and ethical and so on and so forth. And then look at another author and say, this is a bad person. I don't like them. They hurt people. So their work is terrible and harmful and so on and so forth. Because like good people. I say that with quotes because, well, the world is not black and white, in my opinion. So like people who are perceived as good people, they can also on accident add some stuff that maybe shouldn't be in their works. Maybe it's due to unexamined biases or just ignorance. Maybe they just don't know about like some marginalized group of people. So it just happens on accident. And in the same way, people who like hold bigoted views can be great authors. Like maybe it's not always pleasant, but well, talent does not depend on morality, basically. But also, I do agree with what Yulia was saying that in the writing of people who sort of show some kind of bigotry, very often you can see those views bleeding into the work. And maybe the author didn't intend it at all. Maybe they were just trying to write, like, a lighthearted story for kids, but because they're just so rooted into these beliefs, they ended up in the story one way or another. So I guess my take is don't necessarily make your decisions based on what you think about the author, but just sort of use critical thinking, critical reading. I love that. I love being critical about things. So yeah, just wanted to sort of speak in support of Yuda.
Yeah, those are all really interesting points. And I will also add a little bit of gender history. If we think about a lot of the cases of people judging women authors and saying women cannot write about XYZ. Women cannot write about history. A woman should write about beautiful, decorative, landscapes or something. The same was happening throughout time in painting. Women could not paint battle scenes. They had to only paint sunsets. And I think always there is a construction of an author in the public space that the author has some control over. Certainly in commercial publishing, every author is considered a brand, and there's a lot of investment into positioning that brand with the publisher, with the readers, with the marketers. So the artist or the author has only so much control over their image, and their image will affect how people read their work. And another interesting thing that can happen is the author becomes, defined by other authors. In scholarship, this is debate and arguments. And in literature, it happens as well, that there are milieus of people, and they are understood in a place and a time as being in conversation with each other, even if they never met each other in their lives. Sometimes historians later will construct those authors that were both writing at the time of the Renaissance, so they both were impacted in the same way and had some similar themes, but they never knew each other. So, but we still study them together. Why? So those are all, I think, really important questions. And right now, I've become interested in this exact topic, and I'm interested in the context of the elections in America and in the context of politics, how sometimes authors, scholars are also politicized by their time and place. So I'm reading a book, I brought it, called Doppelganger by Naomi Klein, who is a Canadian scholar, and she's writing here about discovering about 10 years ago her doppelganger, essentially another scholar named Naomi Wolf. And Naomi Wolf and Naomi Klein started to be confused by their readers and by commentators, because both of them are very high profile. They are in the mass media. but they are on opposite sides of the political spectrum. Naomi Klein is on the left and very much connected to ideas of climate change and anti-capitalism and workers' rights. And Naomi Wolf is on the far right side, and she thinks the opposite, but their readers confuse them because of their names. So now Naomi Klein has written Doppelganger, about her doppelganger. And in this book, she talks about the sort of long archetype of doppelgangers throughout time. What do? They can replace you. You see them, and, you know, Gogol wrote about doppelgangers, Dostoevsky, and they are kind of like devils that take over your life and can destroy you. And this is something that is happening in politics, that things have become so polarized in American politics that it's like doppelgangers and not really talking to each other. So I'm very interested in these questions as the study of ethos. This was the Greek word for what we're talking about, ethos, the construction of an author just in the public is sometimes different, sometimes the same as how we construct politicians. You know, the image of Trump is beyond his control. It's a lot of money and campaign managers and branding invested into him, and he uses this sort of shock, you know, to gain followers. So the technology that we have now is a new era of authorship, and the questions you're asking, Yulia and Yelizaveta, the questions you're asking, I think, are so important now for authors, because the technology and the social media is how they are read and understood before somebody even picks up their book. I think maybe
Jessica, yeah.
Galina, yeah.
Yeah, do you read in Ukrainian?
Yes.
Wow. Do you happen to see a book by Zychowicz?
What book?
Дівчинка з ведмедиком. A girl with a teddy bear.
No, I haven't.
Wow, it's an amazing book. Unfortunately, it is not translated into English. Well, it's an amazing book. Well, really, it's about two sisters with two different perception of gender roles, and the events took place exactly 100 years ago in Kyiv in 1924. Yes, well, so it's it's a great book. Well, Zychowicz has been forbidden for some time. Well, due to some political issues, because he worked as a spy for the USSR, but he worked for Nazis. Well, so he worked for the USSR, but well, he was in Germany, and his biography is pretty interesting. Well, himself, he's a pretty interesting personality. Well,
and what's his first name?
Zychowicz. It's his nickname. He's Viktor Petrov. Viktor Petrov or Domontovich. Or just sometimes he's written Viktor Domontovich, but usually without Viktor Domontovich, and that's it. Wow. Actually, he wrote only 3 books. This is the best one. So it's amazing, really. It's amazing about how women are actually tried to fight for their rights. So, well, the girl was not a success, but still. So
yeah,
I'm not going to spoil it. Yeah. So it's a good read. It's a really good read. Well,
thank you. I will check that out. And his biography too.
It's something. You will like it.
Thank you.
Interesting.
So I don't know how much more time we have. I want to.
We actually don't, because usually it's an hour or so.
Yeah.
And we already appreciate your time. And I think that's it. Yeah. So if you don't have any questions, yeah, there are no more questions. So Jessica, thank you so much. So this was a great meeting and a great session. And I hope we all learned a lot, and especially about the place and different concepts. Yeah, so, and is it okay if I share the list, if I share the list of your works, or maybe you will send me the list of your works, because
Sure.
yeah, that's fine. Yeah, okay, good.
Sure, absolutely. And everyone, please stay in touch with us at Fulbright Ukraine. We have sometimes online also and in-person events, and they're open, free to the public, and we are open and eager to support TESOL Ukraine. So stay in touch with us, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава! Yeah, and you supported us a lot. Thank you so much.
Keep writing, everybody. Keep writing, even through your writer's block. I have writer's block all the time. It's totally normal. Все буде окей, все буде добре.
Oh, thank you so much. Your support is very important. Thank you. Yeah.
До побачення.
До побачення. До побачення. Thank you, everyone. Yeah. So, and have a safe night. Goodbye.